Nick Clegg lied to me! He said you knew we'd be free! Nick Clegg lied to me! Nick Clegg lied!
And we can now speak to Nick Clegg live in Bath. That must be very dispiriting for you, mustn't it, that even now, all these years on, the issue of tuition fees is still so dominant in voters' minds, they haven't forgiven you for it?
Oh, come on, that's one red-faced heckler from whatever it was, the Socialist Workers' Party or somewhere yelling at me. This happens at election time. Look, of course I accept, and I've always taken it on the chin, and I hope I've always been open about it, that given I lead a party with 8% of MPs in the House of Commons, I'm not Prime Minister, didn't win the election, you have give and take in coalition, so you can't implement your manifesto in full. But I hope, equally, you and other viewers would be fair-minded enough to acknowledge that there are many, many other policies that we have put into practice, which we're very proud of. And this very week, you've got shared parental leave starting, so mums and dads can take off time when a baby is born as they see fit, not in the way that the government's told them. That's a Liberal Democrat thing. You've had Steve Webb, I just heard him on your piece earlier. He's been the architect, a Liberal Democrat architect of these great sweeping pension reforms which give people greater control over their savings, which has seen an increase in the state pension in cash terms, which is the largest that's happened for a generation or two. And just today, over 27 million taxpayers are in total £825 better off than they were when we came into office because of a Liberal Democrat trademark policy of lifting the point at which you pay income tax. So, yes, I accept there will always be controversy from those people who only want to remind me of one policy that we were not able to put into practice. I think there are plenty of fair-minded folk out there who also are prepared to acknowledge there are many, many more policies that we have put into practice that help taxpayers, help pensioners and help families here in Bath and across the country.
And as you say, you put those policies in place with the Conservatives, in a coalition with the Conservatives, and yet you have been calling the Chancellor, George Osborne, the man you've worked with closely for the past 5 years, a very dangerous man whose plan for the public finances would result in economic disaster. Don't you think that's going to be rather confusing for voters?
Yes. No, I don't think so, because the distinction is between what we've done together and what the Conservatives want to do if they're in government on their own. Now, don't take it from me. Listen to George Osborne's announcement. He set it out in lurid terms at the Conservative Party conference last autumn, where he announced that the Conservatives, far from sticking to the balanced approach which we've been taking over the last half a decade to balance the books and do so fairly, and to ask those with the broadest shoulders to make an additional contribution to balancing the books, the Conservatives have said that if they're in government on their own, they're going to do something totally different. They're not going to ask the wealthiest to pay a single extra penny through the tax system in balancing the books, and they're going to penalise the working age poor by taking £12 billion off the poorest families in our country. That's the equivalent to £1,500 taken away from 8 million of the poorest families in this country to balance the books. And I think I'm perfectly entitled to say, why on earth are the Conservatives lurching to the right, departing from the sensible approach that we've taken, the centre ground approach we've taken over the last 5 years? And I'll tell you the answer. They've only been in the centre ground because we've been in government with them. If they were on their own, they've said it in terms, the poorest will pay more for balancing the books. I think it's wrong. I think it's unfair. And that's why I say that the Conservative Party plans for the future, if they were in office on their own, are indeed dangerous.
Now, your colleague, Danny Alexander, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, has said that when he came into office, he was told by one Conservative cabinet minister, you take care of the workers, i.e. the Lib Dems, and we'll take care of the bosses, the Conservatives. Now, the Tories have rounded on him and said he's making that up. And Danny Alexander, when pressed, wouldn't name the minister. Surely, if he's going to come out with statements like that, he should name the minister involved.
I think he's actually being a pretty decent bloke. Of course that was said to him. Anyone who knows Danny Alexander, he's not going to make conversations up. I remember actually vividly when he told me about this, and he's just being, I think he's just being I think he's being perfectly decent by saying, well, that was said, but I'm not going to embarrass the individual by actually pointing the finger at who said it.
Sorry,
but look,
decent
it
by
lifts a lid. It lifts a lid.
Decent by saying the Conservatives said that they are the party of the bosses and the Lib Dems are the parties of the workers as we're coming up to the general election, but he won't name the minister involved.
Well, I think he's perfectly entitled to say that that's what he was told, but he's not going to say which individual said it. It lifts a lid, of course, on exactly the point I was making to you earlier, which is the Conservatives, as they have spelt out, don't believe me, listen to George Osborne, he said it in terms, wouldn't ask those with the broadest shoulders to make a single extra penny of contribution through the tax system to balance the books, which is still something this country needs to do over the next 3 years, and instead they will ask the working age poor to pick up the tab for the mistakes of the bankers. And look, one of the central exam questions for the country, here in Bath and elsewhere, is how do we make sure that all the sacrifices and hard work of millions of people across the country, as we try and recover from this terrible, devastating economic collapse back in 2008, how do we finish the job but finish it fairly? And the Conservatives have been completely upfront about it. If left to their own devices, they wouldn't do it fairly. We are saying, let's stay on the same course as we've been on for the last 5 years, finish the job but finish it in a fair and balanced way.
I mean, you had some very scathing criticisms about the Conservatives in this interview. Do you think you should rule out having another coalition with them if you think they are so very dangerous?
Well, look, we have ensured that in the coalition with the Conservatives, we've made sure that the Conservatives don't do all the things that they now say they want to do on their own, which is give tax cuts to the wealthiest and penalise the poorest. They haven't done that during this coalition government for a very simple reason, because we were there to stop them. By the way, I heard yesterday David Cameron and George Osborne earnestly say they've got no plans to cut taxes for the wealthiest. They jolly well had plans to do just that in coalition with us, and we stopped them and we said no, the priority should be, as we have been consistently saying, the Liberal Democrats, for close to a decade now, the priority instead should be giving tax cuts to people on middle and low income. So look, when it comes to an election and different parties say what they would do differently on their own, I think I'm perfectly entitled to just, if you like, repeat back to George Osborne the words that he himself delivered in a speech last autumn when he made that very major announcement. The Conservatives want to depart from the course we've been on over the last half a decade and instead take a very ideological approach to cuts to public services and a very ideological approach in which the poorest, rather than the wealthiest, are asked to make the greatest contribution. That's not the Liberal Democrat way. It hasn't been the way over the last 5 years. It hasn't been that way because we've stopped it, and we, of course, would seek to do so again if the same circumstances were to arise again.
Nick Clegg, thank you very much for talking to Sky News.
Thank you.